Can't overrun the base, can they?
Ever heard of Dien, Phil?
No.
Good.
When someone talks about Vietnam, they think usually about Hueys, M16s, Hoorah, and the entire plot of either Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket. The latter is the better of the two movies, fight me. Your thoughts usually include American accents, green dress GIs, and generally speaking, people don't question how or why they got there. Granted, there's a few reasons why we don't tend to see media as to how or why we got there in the first place, but, that's a topic for another day. The long short is, it's a war that nobody in their right mind would have joined if they knew the reality of the situation on the ground. But how often when someone talks about Vietnam and war, do people think about the First Indochina War, where France fought its own war against the Vietnamese and lost just as the United States did later? Well, today we will spend some time and talk about that war, the French-Vietnam War, a war that ended not with a whimper, like the American War and the fleeing of Saigon, but with a crushing defeat. The First Indochina War was fought from the 19th of December 1946 to the 1st of August 1954, and it stands as possibly one of the most pivotal conflicts in the 20th century, shaping the destinies of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, France, the United States, China, Australia, and so many more nations. Without this war, the American War never happens, the Chinese invasion of Vietnam never happens, the Vietnamese occupation of communist Cambodia never happens, not to mention the dominoes that fell domestically in the domestic politics of countries during the so-called swinging 60s. Hell, there's an entire governmental collapse in Australia that probably does not happen. The war's significance extends beyond its immediate participants, and it involves major world powers with famous leaders from the Second World War playing key parts. Names like Charles de Gaulle, Philippe Leclerc, Dwight Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, and more, which begs the question, why is it so unknown to us in the English-speaking world when it impacted us so greatly? Well, the answer is recency bias. It genuinely is just recency bias. We understand the American Vietnam War more because it was more recent. It's the same reason we forget Korea ever happened. Or many people do forget Korea ever happened. It's why it's a forgotten war. Because Vietnam was bigger. It's just funny in this case that Vietnam was bigger than Vietnam. But anyway, to understand the war, it is essential to first explore the colonial history of Indochina and the story of Vietnam, a people who endured 1,000 years of Chinese rule before driving them out for good in 1426. The country would then go through years of civil conflict, corruption and hardship. Rival dynasties would fight over who controlled the land until finally, after over 300 years of struggle, the nation was unified under Emperor Jia Long in the city of Hue in 1802. Independence and unity wouldn't last very long though, as a few decades later a French expedition landed in the south, Cochin China. In May 1883, the National Assembly in France would vote to expand control to the north with a serious investment towards the expedition, with the intention to establish a protectorate in the region. Conservative politician Jules Delafosse was a bit clearer in his intent though, stating that it was better to call things by their actual name, referring to Indochina as a possession. By the late 19th century, France had established total control over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, collectively referring to it as French Indochina. French colonial rule brought about economic exploitation, cultural imposition, and significant social changes, such as a roaring opium addiction. While the French introduced modern infrastructure and education, these benefits were largely confined to a select few elites, with the majority of the population experiencing poverty and disenfranchisement. Most people still live the same way their medieval ancestors did. The educated and elite Vietnamese subjects lived entirely different lives from the average Vietnamese person, who lived often surviving on subsistence farming. Like with the rest of the world, the 19th and 20th century saw a rise in nationalism amongst cultural groups. Rather than seeing themselves as French because they were regularly reminded that they weren't, the rural Vietnamese began to look for a leader. Somebody to rally around as Vietnamese people, a Vietnamese leader. As the year 1900 came around at this time, I feel like it's the perfect opportunity to introduce you to quite possibly the main character in our story today, Win Sin Kung. I probably said that wrong. You may know him though as the name we all know, and the name we can all say correctly, Ho Chi Minh. Generally speaking, the First Indochina War saw several key actors vying for influence and control, and this will get confusing as we go on, so I'm going to lay out the main characters here to avoid any confusion before we get into the full narrative. Firstly, there's the Viet Minh. Think of them as a precursor to the Viet Cong. They're very different, but just to help with understanding. This group is led by Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap. Now, Giap is vital, and he's actually on the thumbnail of this video for a key reason. But these two men and the Viet Minh represent a broad coalition of nationalists and communist forces seeking independence. Ho himself is a fascinating person, and he's central to this story. I won't spend too much time discussing him, otherwise we'll be here all day, but to give you a bit of backstory, he was born in a central Vietnamese village in 1890. Ho's father was the son of a concubine who had worked hard to give his child an education. He would attend the Quoc Hoc High School, but would be expelled in 1908 for revolutionary activity. He would teach for a time, and then in 1911 he would join the crew of a French freighter. For 3 years he would travel the world, spending a year in the United States working as an assistant pastry chef in London, and really just exploring. As time passed, Ho became more and more political and highly educated, learning multiple languages such as English, French, several Chinese dialects, and later on, Russian. With the First World War at an end, he appealed to Woodrow Wilson for support in Vietnamese independence in 1919, but he was completely ignored. In 1924, he travelled to Moscow where he met with Soviet leaders before becoming an interpreter for Soviet advisors to Chiang Kai-shek. After Chiang turned on the Reds though, Ho made his way back to Europe, lived in Paris for a time, and then he declared his life would be dedicated to revolution. Ho would make his way back to Asia in 1928 where he met with exiles from Indochina in Bangkok, before moving to Hong Kong in 1929. It was here that he attempted to unite the revolutionaries of Indochina into one cohesive force with the support and backing of Moscow. The revolutionaries would attempt multiple uprisings across Indochina, but France would respond brutally, putting them down and issuing warrants for the arrest of multiple influential figures, including Ho. To escape, he bribed a nurse to declare him dead, and he fled Hong Kong into China, then in a state of extreme civil unrest, until finally in 1941, on foot, after 3 decades, and finally using the name Ho Chi Minh, he crossed into Vietnam, taking up residence in a cave in the northern hills, and so the legend of Uncle Ho began. Giap, meanwhile, was a self-trained, self-taught military leader who started from absolutely nothing to grow to lead the Viet Minh in combat. He would lead specifically as a military leader during the war, while Ho, in many ways, was the political leader. We will talk more about his exploits later on when we get to Dien Bien Phu. However, what you need to remember about Giap is he in many ways is one of the greatest military leaders of the 21st century, and he taught himself. And even more to remember about these two men is they were more than willing to trade lives for victory, because in the grand scheme of things they are quoted and paraphrased as saying that lives are something they have in abundance. They can and will sacrifice them for the greater cause. Opposing these two men, and really there are a lot of other major players in force here within Vietnam and the Viet Minh structure, however I don't want to overwhelm you with names, but opposing the Viet Minh were the French colonial forces, supported by local troops loyal to the colonial regime. France utilised their superior weaponry and training but faced logistical challenges and a hostile population in this war. What must be said though is that France never lacked for volunteers if they had the money to pay them. Even right at the end, there was always those willing to put their hands out to take some money off the French to join them. Other local factions, including religious sects, non-communist nationalists, they all played roles of varying significance, sometimes collaborating with the French or the Viet Minh or both at the same time. And of course, you have the international actors, most notably the United States, China, both the nationalist Chinese and later the People's Republic, and the Soviet Union. They all became increasingly involved as the war progressed, providing material, financial, and diplomatic support to whichever side they preferred. The origins of the First Indochina War are rooted in a complex series of political, social, and economic factors, but to give you the TLDR, the Vietnamese were tired of being a French colony, being second-class citizens in their own homeland. French colonial policies had alienated a large segment of the population, fostering resentment and a desire for change. The economic exploitation of land and resources benefited the colonial administration and local collaborators, but rural peasant farmers, the majority of the population, they suffered under heavy taxation and land dispossession. World War II acted here as it did in so many nations as a catalyst for the coming conflict. The Japanese occupation from 1940 to 1945 disrupted French control and emboldened nationalist movements because yes, even though they were communist, the Viet Minh goal of a free, unified Vietnam is based in traditional nationalism and national identity. Between 1945 and 46, Vietnam experienced a brief but decisive window in which independence seemed not only possible but guaranteed. With this opportunity there, the Viet Minh, the nationalist coalition, led by Ho Chi Minh, and dominated by the communists, moved quickly to declare in what today is known as the August Revolution, a free Vietnam. They seized control of Hanoi and major cities across Vietnam with minimal resistance and strong public support. This was largely possible because they had bided their time, waited for the Japanese defeat, and then seized a moment where the absence of effective colonial authority existed after the collapse of Japanese rule. Effectively, they waited until they had a grey area. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh formally proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. Within this declaration, he drew on the language of the American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution, emphasizing national self-determination and popular sovereignty. However, international developments quickly undermined the new Vietnam's position, because that window, well, it was just a window. Later, in September 1945, British forces landed in southern Vietnam, with the official task of disarming the Japanese troops. In practice, though, they facilitated the return of the French forces, viewing the restoration of French authority as preferable to a communist-led nationalist movement. The Allies went so far as to invite the much-hated Chinese forces into the north of the country to occupy it, which, if you know anything about Vietnamese history, you know it's the equivalent of asking the Russian Empire to occupy Poland, and to top it off, Japanese forces would be deployed in policing actions under Allied orders. By late 1945, the British had handed the power back to the French, who had reasserted control over Cochinchina, directly challenging Viet Minh authority and signalling their determination to rebuild their colonial empire in full. This is all under the auspices of Charles de Gaulle, by the way. Despite growing tensions, both sides initially sought compromise. On March 6, 1946, the Franco-Viet Minh Agreement was signed, and France recognised Vietnam as a free state within the French Union. The idea of this new French Union was that there would be a sort of federalisation of the French Empire, the idea being that this new superpower would stay together. But the issue with this is there's a lot of French people who saw themselves as superior to their inferior subjects. On paper, Viet Minh accepted the temporary presence of French troops in the north, but for Ho Chi Minh, the agreement was a tactical concession meant to buy time, to avoid immediate war, to gain international recognition. For France, it preserved colonial influence while postponing fundamental decisions about sovereignty and really just kicking the can down the road. Negotiations continued through mid-1946, including talks in France, but they ultimately failed. Ho Chi Minh was welcomed in France and treated initially as a head of state during this trip, only to be taken aside and berated and told essentially to stay in his lane and be a good subject. This ended any chance of the Viet Minh even tacitly accepting a French influence on the nation. The Viet Minh insisted on full independence and the unification of northern, central, and southern Vietnam into one nation. France, however, sought to maintain Cochinchina as a separate entity and resisted granting any true sovereignty. Mutual distrust and political pressure within France and hardening positions on both sides meant that compromise was now impossible. The breakdown finally became violent in November 1946 when French forces bombarded the port city of Haiphong, killing thousands of civilians. This attack convinced the Viet Minh that peaceful negotiations had ended and were pointless. On December 19, 1946, Viet Minh forces launched coordinated attacks against French positions in Hanoi, massacring French officers and people connected to the French command structure, and these actions marked the beginning of a full-scale war between Vietnam and France, beginning one of the long sagas of the 21st century that did not end, at least on the Western perspective, until the last helicopter fled Saigon in 1975. But for the Vietnamese, it ended way after, because they still had to deal with a Chinese invasion after the American intervention. During the early years of the war, France appeared to possess a clear military superiority over the Viet Minh, and this isn't at all shocking considering the fact that the post-Second World War years in France were marked by a concerted effort to increase military spending across the nation. As France rearmed with new planes, ships, tanks, and guns, it sent them abroad to ensure the empire would remain. Because as de Gaulle himself put it, without the empire, France would lose its position in the world. With better equipment, professional troops, and control over major cities, the French believed they could quickly crush the Vietnamese resistance and reassert colonial authority. After all, it was only farmers in pyjamas with old guns, right? However, despite early advantages, French strategies during this period failed to eliminate the Viet Minh, allowing the conflict to evolve into a prolonged and increasingly complex war, and there were a couple of reasons why. To take a quick sidebar, the image of the Vietnam War in the American sense is one of helicopters and mobility. During the French War, though, control of road systems was paramount. The French military would set out undertaking sweeps along roads to drive the Viet Minh from the area, but the thing is, if you come out and force to stop the Viet Minh, they can just retreat into the jungle, or worse, they can ambush you. The road from Hanoi to Haiphong became so bad for ambushes that the French authorities bulldozed entire sections of forest and at least an entire village. The French had to be everywhere all at once, and so they had to resort to the Foreign Legion. And yeah, this included former SS members and Germans looking for employment. They also relied heavily on well-paid locals and other Asian cultural groups who hated the Viet Minh. But here's the thing, these groups would often just resort to brutality. In one instance, listed by Max Hastings in his book on Vietnam, an old couple and their grandson were in a small wooden boat shipping rice after curfew. The young man of military age was executed when he was stopped. When the French officers were pressed, they bluntly said the more brutal they were, the more the Vietnamese would listen. And they were correct, the Vietnamese did listen, and they learnt. Just not in the way they thought they would. In 1947, France launched Operation Lei, a major military offensive aimed at ending the war decisively and quickly. The operation's goal was to capture Ho Chi Minh and dismantle the Viet Minh leadership by striking deep into their bases in northern Vietnam, particularly in the highlands along the Chinese border and that kind of area. While the operation initially achieved some successes by penetrating Viet Minh-held territory, it completely failed in its strategic objectives. Ho Chi Minh and key leaders escaped, and the Viet Minh avoided destruction by retreating into dense jungles in mountainous regions to continue their war of attrition through raids and ambushing. This failure demonstrated the limits of conventional military power when facing a highly mobile and disciplined guerrilla force, and honestly, it should have been the wake-up call to French leadership. It's worth mentioning Philippe Leclerc, commander in Indochina just prior to Operation Lei himself, said that the war could never be won militarily, that it was just too much of a guerrilla war, that it was an impossibility for conventional forces to win this war in any way that could be considered a victory. He was completely ignored by Charles de Gaulle. And sadly, he would later die in 1947 in a plane crash in Africa, just being totally pushed to the side and ignored even though he was completely correct. The terrain of Vietnam, combined with local support, gave the Viet Minh a crucial advantage in a guerrilla war. French forces, though strong in open battle, struggled to control rural areas and protect supply lines, not in a dissimilar way to how the Americans would later struggle. By 1948, the Viet Minh, buoyed by success, had expanded beyond military resistance and began constructing parallel governments in rural areas. These administrations collected taxes, enforced laws, and provided basic services. They strengthened their legitimacy among the peasantry by doing this. This development marked a significant shift in the conflict, as the war increasingly became one as a struggle for political authority rather than purely just military dominance. While the French maintained control over the cities, the Viet Minh steadily consolidated influence in the countryside, undermining colonial rule from the ground up through carrots, but also a very big willingness to use the stick against villagers who did not play ball. So you either feared the Viet Minh, or you supported them. You couldn't have it both ways. In response to this growing challenge, France attempted to counter Viet Minh legitimacy by establishing the State of Vietnam in 1949, headed by the former Emperor Bao Dai. This new government was intended to offer a non-communist alternative for the nationalists under French guidance. However, it lacked any genuine independence and popular support, and this limited its effectiveness. Many Vietnamese viewed it as a puppet regime, which is what it truly was, and this only further strengthened the Viet Minh's claim to represent true national liberation. As it stood by September 1949, the Vietnamese could not fight the French in the open. If they tried, they lost, and lost badly. But they were a boil the French could not lance. The balance of the war, though, shifted dramatically in October 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War. This development totally transformed the wider strategic environment as the Viet Minh gained access to modern weapons, military training, and secure bases across the Chinese border that the French could not touch. What had been a largely self-sustained guerrilla movement now benefited from powerful external support, setting the stage for a more conventional and intensified phase of war. The years 1950 to 52 marked the decisive turning point for the conflict, as it transformed from just a colonial confrontation into an international struggle within the whole Cold War. In January 1950, the newly established People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union officially recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh as its leader. This recognition was crucial as it gave the Viet Minh international legitimacy, and more importantly, access to military and logistical support. China, sharing a long border with northern Vietnam, became the Vietnamese forces' most significant ally, supplying weapons, training, and sanctuary. In response, the United States moved quickly to contain what it perceived as the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. In February 1950, Washington recognized Bao Dai's state of Vietnam and began to quietly support the French war effort. From 1950 onwards, though, US involvement expanded rapidly with military aid to France, increasing on a colossal scale. Eventually, 80% of the total cost of the war was being subsidized by the United States taxpayer. While US forces did not fight directly, well, officially, they absolutely did, they just painted French markings on their aircraft. American funding, equipment, and advisors became indispensable to French operations. This development tied the Indochina conflict directly to the broader Cold War, making Vietnam a frontline in the global struggle between communism and anti-communism. The military consequences of this campaign were immediate because in September and October 1950, the Viet Minh launched the Border Campaign, a series of coordinated attacks on French outposts along the Chinese border in the nominally French-controlled part of the north of Vietnam. These operations resulted in a major French defeat as the Viet Minh overran key positions and destroyed several French columns. The loss of control over the northern supply routes was catastrophic for the French, both militarily and psychologically, and it demonstrated the growing strength and confidence of the Viet Minh, now bolstered by the Chinese. With the situation nearing a full-blown crisis, France appointed General Jean de la Tour de Tassigny as commander in December 1950. He would reorganize French forces and adopted a more defensive strategy, protecting the Red River Delta, the economic and political heart of French-held Vietnam, abandoning the jungles in many areas to the communists. In 1951, he achieved several important defensive victories, notably at Dien and Mau Cay. These battles temporarily stabilized the front and restored some of the French morale, showing that the Viet Minh could be checked if they were fought under conditions that favored French forces and Western doctrines. What he did not account for at the same time was that the Viet Minh were undergoing a significant transformation. Between 1951 and 52, they shifted from primarily a guerrilla warfare to more conventional military operations, organizing their forces into regular divisions capable of large-scale campaigns. This evolution reflected an increased amount of resources and also confidence, and it exposed them to higher casualties. But it worked. In 1952, the Viet Minh launched campaigns in the northwest of Vietnam and Laos, aiming to expand their strategic reach and further weaken French control over Indochina, which, remember, includes Cambodia and Laos as well as Vietnam. This whole conflict was on a tipping point. It was a brutal stalemate that could go either way. For the French, though, it was getting expensive, and so with all their cards on the table, French leadership took a gamble. They fortified a small location in the northwest. Its name was Dien Bien Phu. After years of fighting, neither the French nor the Viet Minh had achieved a decisive victory, and both sides were incredibly bloodied. French forces controlled most major cities and lines of communication, while the Viet Minh dominated the countryside and retained the initiative through guerrilla warfare, with a focus on the roads between towns. Mounting casualties, rising costs, and declining public support in France was creating immense pressure for a resolution. France needed a big win, if not a knockout blow, and to do this they tried to bait the Vietnamese into a battle at Dien Bien Phu, a place far enough from the cities that they would feel confident in attacking. In May 1953, Henry Navarre, the general, was appointed the commander of French forces in Indochina. At this point in the conflict, it was clear that France would need to seek terms, but what those terms would be dependent on the situation on the ground. Navarre inherited a difficult situation, a war that France was increasingly unable to win outright, yet politically unwilling to abandon without securing a favourable position. To address this dilemma, Navarre devised this baiting strategy and named it creatively the Navarre Plan. The Navarre Plan rested on a critical assumption, though, that the Viet Minh, while effective as a guerrilla force, would be vulnerable in a large-scale set-piece battle against a superior force with better firepower and air support. Navarre believed that by luring the Viet Minh into such a confrontation, France would be able to inflict devastating losses while weakening their military capacity. This in turn would strengthen France's hand at any future negotiations, and possibly allow them to control the south. This strategy marked a shift away from counterinsurgency towards a more conventional military approach. To implement this plan, the French established a heavily fortified base at Dien Bien Phu in late 1943, located in a remote valley in northwest Vietnam near the Laotian border. Dien Bien Phu was intended to serve as a strategic stronghold, and from this position, the French hoped to block the Viet Minh supply routes into Laos and provoke a decisive battle. The valley was chosen in part because French commanders believed it was inaccessible for heavy Viet Minh artillery, and if the Vietnamese tried to bring the heavy artillery in, it would be very obvious and in the open and to be easily destroyed by air support. The French genuinely believed that the Vietnamese would have no answer to this air support, and they expected the aircraft to be able to fly in and destroy any targets with impunity. Surrounded by mountains and dense jungle, Dien Bien Phu appeared to be a fortress with defenders who controlled the air and held an unattackable position. This assumption would prove, if you haven't guessed it yet, fatally flawed, and unknown to the French, the Viet Minh commander, Giap, as we spoke about before, was kind of a genius at this kind of stuff, and he prepared a meticulous and innovative response. He drew on lessons from previous campaigns, previous defeats, and he, benefiting from Chinese support, Giap orchestrated an extraordinary logistical effort. Throughout 1953, thousands of Viet Minh soldiers, civilian labourers, and basically anyone he could find, transported heavy artillery and ammunition and supplies through mountains and jungles, often by hand or bicycle. Artillery pieces were disassembled, hauled over the difficult terrain, and reassembled in concealed positions overlooking the valley. These guns were then carefully camouflaged and entrenched, rendering them difficult to detect, or let alone destroy. It was genuinely a masterstroke in leadership, and something the French were completely unprepared for. On March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh launched their assault on Dien Bien Phu. The opening artillery barrage shocked the French defenders, immediately shattering the illusion of safety. Viet Minh guns systemically targeted French positions, including the vital airstrip in the centre of the compound, which was essential for resupply and evacuation. Within days, the airstrip was rendered unusable, forcing French aircraft to drop supplies by parachute, which simply in most cases fell in Vietnamese hands. From March to May 1954, the siege intensified. Viet Minh forces employed trench warfare, gradually tightening the noose around the French positions. Their artillery dominance prevented effective French counterattacks and made resupply nearly impossible. As ammunition, food, and medical supplies dwindled, morale among French troops completely collapsed. Wounded soldiers overwhelmed the field hospitals, and disease started to spread through the overcrowded bunkers and trench systems. Despite desperate appeals for assistance, including consideration of US air intervention, no effective relief arrived. There is talk, and Max Hastings covers this, where the US went to the British and said, "We'll intervene if you do." And Churchill turned around and went, "No way. Not at all." The French garrison, isolated and exhausted, continued to resist, but it was steadily overwhelmed. Giap, though, suffering heavy casualties, maintained relentless pressure, demonstrating his willingness to endure losses in pursuit of a wider victory. His decision to transition from rapid assaults to a prolonged siege reflect his adaptability and his understanding of the French vulnerabilities. The French grew incredibly desperate. Parachute infantry began to jump over the siege, knowing full well that they would likely land among the enemy and die before they hit the ground, but reminded by their officers and leaders that they could not surrender and they had to go because they carried the shame of their fathers who lost France in the 1940s. On May the 7th, 1954, after 56 days of continuous fighting, the French forces at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. But it wasn't exactly a choice because the defeat was total. Resistance was gone. more than 10,000 French soldiers were killed and wounded or captured. And the loss, it reverberated far beyond the battlefield in any way that France had not experienced since the catastrophes at Sedan or the Ardennes in World War I. Militarily, Dien Bien Phu marked the destruction of a significant portion of the French expeditionary force, but make no mistake, there were still many French forces in the country. Psychologically, though, they were shattered. Politically, the consequences were even more profound. The defeat occurred just as peace talks were beginning at the Geneva Conference, and this absolutely shattered the French negotiating position, and it accelerated France's decision to withdraw entirely from Indochina to accept the division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel. For the Viet Minh, Dien Bien Phu was a monumental triumph. It was their Yorktown. It changed everything. Nearly 8 years of conflict between the French forces and the Viet Minh had exhausted France militarily, economically, politically, and socially. The crushing French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954 demonstrated that the continued colonial rule in Indochina was not going to happen. The French had had enough of this. The French people had had enough of this. And that is before we even get to the state of the armed forces in the region. Because of the defeat, international pressure had stepped up, and a pressure to negotiate an end of the war to stabilise Southeast Asia and end the fighting was growing paramount. And ultimately, this led to the Geneva Conference held between April and July 1954, almost shutting the French out. The conference brought together a wide array of international actors including France, the Viet Minh, the United States, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, the United Kingdom, and more, and representatives from neighbouring states such as Laos and Cambodia. While France sought an honourable exit from the failing colonial war, the Viet Minh, though, they aimed to secure recognition of total Vietnamese independence. The major powers, meanwhile, sought to either spread or contain communism depending on their positions. You can kind of guess who was who on that regard. Negotiations were complex and tense as the Viet Minh entered the conference from the position of military strength, having demonstrated their ability to defeat a modern European army, fresh off the victory in the northwest. France, by contrast, was eager to withdraw, but hoped to preserve some influence in the region and possibly control over key cities. China and the Soviet Union, while supportive of the Viet Minh, favoured compromise though, to avoid provoking direct confrontation with the United States. Although not a signatory to the final agreement, the US participated in the discussions and strongly opposed any outcome that might lead to a unified communist Vietnam. Status quo suited the superpowers just fine. After all, it's not like this could trigger another war or anything. On July 21st, 1954, the Accords were formally signed, and this marked the official end of the First Indochina War. One of the most significant provisions was the temporary division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Under this agreement, the Viet Minh assumed control of the northern region, while the south came under the authority of a French-backed government. This division was explicitly described as provisional, and not intended to establish a permanent political boundary. The Accords emphasized Vietnam's territorial unity and sovereignty in principle. In reality, it became clear pretty quickly that the division was going to be long-term, akin to the two Koreas or the two Germanys. A key provision in the Geneva Accords, though, was the scheduling of nationwide elections in July 1956, and these elections were intended to reunify Vietnam under a single government chosen by popular vote. But this led to the correct assumption among many of the observers, including the US officials, that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were going to win this election due to their popular support and nationalist credentials. And this plays a very key part in the future American decisions in the region. The Accords also required France to withdraw its military forces from Indochina, effectively ending nearly a century of French colonial presence in the region. French troops were to evacuate Vietnam in stages, while civilians were given a period of time to relocate to the south if they chose to, which many did. This provision triggered a large-scale population movements, with hundreds of thousands of civilians, particularly the Vietnamese Catholics, fleeing to the south, fearing persecution under communist rule. In addition to addressing Vietnam, the Geneva Accords also formally recognised the independence of Laos and Cambodia in 1954 as well, because both countries, although part of French Indochina, and having experienced varying degrees of conflict during the war, were geographically located inland, and to be honest, their awkward position made any attempt to hold them completely pointless. Despite all these compromises, the United States and South Vietnamese government refused to sign the agreement, citing concerns over communist expansion and the fairness of any future elections. Shocking that this was coming. As a result, the accords lacked effective enforcement mechanisms, and so, these accords, they were effectively just vague promises on paper. They were about as effective as a Russian promise not to invade its neighbour within 10 years. By 1956, the war was over. At least that was the public opinion. Anyone who knew what they were talking about and had spent time in the region could tell you that it was a time bomb. The human cost of the conflict alone, though, was staggering. Over 400,000 people were dead, many of them civilians caught in the crossfire from either side. And entire villages had been destroyed. Infrastructure was devastated and millions were displaced. Taken alone, the First Indochina War itself is a horrific event that would be considered a formative event for a nation. For the Vietnamese, this was the first of 3 major powers it would have to fight over the next 30 years to achieve full independence. For France, meanwhile, the war represented a catastrophic blow to its colonial ambitions, and any remaining national pride in the military. The defeat at Dien Phu and the subsequent withdrawal from Indochina severely weakened France's global prestige, and it accelerated the collapse of its empire. The psychological impact of the loss contributed to political instability within France itself, and it foreshadowed future conflicts and governments collapsing. Most notably, one of the big conflicts this helped trigger was the Algerian War of Independence, which, an already shaky French domestic position, went into that war not with the most confidence, to say the least. France's sons would suffer for decades due to the shame of the loss in World War II in Vietnam, with countless young men dying to try and reclaim this sense of honour that had allegedly been lost. In a strange way, the French loss would also lead to the feeling of overconfidence in the United States. After all, it was just the French. It's not like these rice farmers could beat a corn-fed real army, right? Right? But hey, that's a story for another time. Maybe. It depends if you want more Vietnam content. This video, as part of a series on French history, has been a joy to research and put together. I really do recommend you all read the book Vietnam by Max Hastings. He was actually on the ground during the fall of Saigon, as he covers at the start of the book, so it's really, really, really in-depth, and it's genuinely quite good. And then I also recommend doing some extra reading. And above all, read sources from the Vietnamese perspective as well. Because the Vietnam War is not a simple war between communists and capitalists. It's not. It's a war of independence. It's a war of a group of people who wanted their own nation. And for that reason alone, it is fascinating. And the more you understand about Vietnam, the more you stop and question, why did we ever go there in the first place? Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you all to the patrons, and I will catch you all next time.